I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Whatever it is, they try and channel it for
You will
good.
see a procession of
denied what they think is false argument, free and uncorrupted communication.
We have three splendid panelists who have agreed to speak to you today. I will introduce them in turn. They will have a maximum of 10 minutes to speak from the center podium. And following their presentation, we will have responses by Professor Falk and Professor Arguella. And then we will have responses from you. There are two microphones up front, so be thinking in terms of what you would like to ask. Please don't make any lengthy speeches of yourself or of your own, because I've got the gong here, and I will use it mercilessly. First to speak is Stanley Roden. Stan was our district attorney for 8 years before entering private practice, and he is now in the field of legal mediation. Stan Roden.
My thanks too to City College Adult Ed Program, to the League of Women Voters, and to the other sponsors, and my hat's off to the two wonderful speakers that you've just heard. I don't want to take a lot of time at this point, other than to broad brush some thoughts and hopefully generate some more debate, because I think that's the real value here. First thing is, I kind of asked myself this question: if the administration had asked me before we invaded Iraq, would that be a legal act? I kind of broke it into 4 boxes, and hopefully that will help a little bit here, at least from a legal or from a lawyer's perspective of the issues. If in fact, under the UN Charter, a combination of sections 2, subsection 4, and Article 51, which we heard a little bit about, if a country is in the process of attacking another country, can you defend yourself? And the answer is obvious, of course. No real evidence is necessary other than the fact that an attack is underway, and therefore the right of self-defense comes into play. There's mechanisms within the Charter for how you notify the Security Council and so forth, but obviously you have the right to defend yourself. 2, if that attack is on the ground and about to be in process, and you have evidence that the attack is about to be in process, or part of it is in process, can you, in a sense, take anticipatory actions to prevent what you know to be an immediate threat or an immediate attack? The answer is yes. And both of these yeses are true in national law in every state in this country and in the federal system for the rules of self-defense. There's an exact parallel between those two. 3, if there is what appears to be a threat, however you describe it, whether it's the missiles in Cuba or weapons of mass destruction or other forms of aggressive types of materials and manpower, and clear and convincing evidence that that is going to be used in the near term, can you defend yourself? That gets a little grayer in terms of the existing rules, but there is no doubt that as the quantum of evidence increases of the intention for someone to use that men and material in an offensive way in the near term, you can defend yourself. And in many ways, the Cuban Missile Crisis speaks to that kind of situation. Last, you have a situation where men and materials may be assembled. Guns are being made, planes are being manufactured, uniforms are being sewn, and so on and so forth. Can you then attack because someday this growing threat, however you deduce it, is going to become an attack. The answer under the rules and under common sense is no. And I was glad to hear Professor Arguella talk about the concept of diplomacy and something short of the actual use of force being used. These are not easy questions. So what really disturbed me this week was to ask ourselves, how did we get into this war? And the answer is we got into this war, we almost got into a world war over the Cuban Missile Crisis, we got into the Vietnam War, and it appears that we got into the Iraq War because of some concepts I'd like to throw out, and I hope that'll generate some discussion here. One, if you don't have a sufficient quantum of evidence, whether you call it clear and convincing evidence or proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that an attack is about to occur, but yet then exercise the right of so-called preventive or preemptive war, however you want to describe it. And for me, those two terms are another forms of self-defense only. Then you have to ask yourself, how sure am I that the conclusion I'm drawing about the intentions of my opponent are actually offensive? And that leads me to an article this week in the LA Times called Looking at the War Through the Looking Glass, where Duffel's report, recent report, made it clear that the two sides in this what turned out to be the war saw it very differently. Hussein actually bluffed, after he destroyed the weapons of mass destruction, the article points out, bluffed the world to show that he still had them as a way of keeping Iran at bay, believing that the CIA was smart enough to know it was a bluff. The United States, on the other hand, never believed a word the man said. This is so reminiscent of the Vietnam War. And those of you who have seen The Fog of War, the Morris film on McNamara's life in retrospective, know the very first rule this man came up with after 50 years of government service, from World War II bombing missions with LeMay and so forth through the Vietnam War, was empathize with your enemy, which means try and understand. I think there's a tremendous cultural divide, and Richard Falk touched on that. This concept of good and evil being somehow evangelized into Christian terms makes us blind to other cultures. And the more you don't empathize, you're not capable of empathizing, you can't listen. And when you can't listen, you can't learn. And when you can't learn, you make mistakes. It's really a very simple formula. I see that played out every day in the mediations I conduct. The dynamics are not any different. People demonize the other side, number one. Number two, they don't listen because they only listen to what they want to hear. And three, once you're only listening to an echo, you're not learning. Once you're not learning, you're making mistakes. And so it seems to me this concept of preemptive war is based on the idea of perfect information. And if anything, this war solidifies for, I hope for everybody in this room, no matter what side of this question you're on, is we don't live in a world with perfect information. So that brings me to my last point. The United Nations didn't grow, didn't evolve because somebody woke up or some buddies woke up one day and say, hey, this is a good idea. The United Nations concept of collective security grew out of tens of millions of deaths between 1914 and 1945. It grew out of a concept that if we didn't collectivize and somehow find a way to deal with conflict, short of individual countries making individual decisions on imperfect information across tremendous cultural divides, we were going to end up with this endless stream of war after war after war after war. So the concept that cemented the United Nations is as useful and important today as it was in 1946. The concept of collective security through the Security Council is as useful and important today as it was in 1946. The concept of self-defense, where there's an imminent threat, is as useful today as it was in 1946. And yes, I agree that terrorists are not states. They're more difficult to find, more difficult to deal with, but I agree with what Professor Falk said. This is a police action, and we should collectively be forming the kind of police action to deal with these common criminals and not bombing other countries as a way of attempting to deal with the problem.
Stephen Zunis is the Professor of Politics and Chair of the Peace and Justice Studies Program at the University of San Francisco. Stephen?
Thank you. Back in my radical student days, when I was envisioning an imminent transformation of the world order into a peaceful, democratic, and egalitarian global community, little did I imagine that I would be here in 2004 fighting for what may be a losing battle simply to save the liberalism of my parents' generation, a liberalism based on notions of collective security and rule of law embodied in the United Nations Charter. According to the UN Charter, of course, with the important exception of self-defense against armed attack, no member state has the right to enforce any resolution militarily unless the Security Council determines that there's been a material breach of its resolutions, decides that all non-military means of enforcement have been exhausted, and specifically authorizes the use of military force. This is what the Security Council did in November 1990 with Resolution 678 in response to Iraq's occupation of Kuwait, which violated a series of resolutions demanding their withdrawal. And it's important to remember that legally the conflict regarding access for UN inspectors and possible Iraqi procurement of weapons of mass destruction subsequent to the Gulf War was always between Iraq and the United Nations. It was not between Iraq and the United States. And although UN Security Council Resolution 687 was the most detailed in the world body's history, this is the one that demanded Iraqi disarmament, no military enforcement mechanisms were specified, nor did the Security Council specify any military enforcement mechanisms in subsequent resolutions, including 1441. In any case, when the U.S. did invade Iraq in March of last year, Iraq had allowed UN inspectors back in. They had unlimited, unfettered access to wherever they wanted to go, whenever they wanted to go to it. And furthermore, as we know now, and as many people, myself included, were arguing before the invasion, Iraq had already disarmed and revealed all that they knew. In short, there is serious question as to whether the Iraqi government was still in material breach of the resolution at the time of the U.S. invasion. And even if they were still in violation, if the United States can unilaterally claim the right to invade Iraq because of that country's violations of UN Security Council resolutions, what's stopping other council members from claiming the right to invade states that are similarly in violation? Russia could claim the right to invade Israel. France could claim the right to invade Turkey. Britain could claim the right to invade Morocco. Remember, today, as it was at the time of the invasion of Iraq, there are over 100 UN Security Council resolutions being violated by countries other than Iraq. Some of these deal with nuclear weapons programs, such as UN Security Council Resolution 487, which calls on Israel to hand over its nuclear facilities onto the trusteeship of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or UN Security Council Resolution 1172, which calls on Pakistan and India to eliminate their nuclear weapons and their ballistic missile program. It's rather striking, when you read the resolution passed by Congress slightly over 2 years ago, authorizing the use of force. It claims in part that, quote, the risk that the current Iraqi regime will either employ biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons to launch a surprise attack against the United States or provide them to international terrorists who would do so, combine to justify action by the United States to defend itself. In other words, these members of the House and Senate who supported this resolution believed or claimed to believe that an impoverished third world country which had eliminated its stockpiles of banned weapons, destroyed its medium and long-range missiles, eliminated its weapons of mass destruction programs more than a decade earlier, and had been suffering for over a dozen years from the most comprehensive international sanctions in world history, sanctions that made it impossible to import the necessary technology and raw materials to reconstitute these programs, somehow threatened the national security of a superpower located more than 10,000 miles away. Furthermore, these members of Congress believed or claimed to believe that the supposed threat was so great that the United States had no choice but to launch an invasion of that country, overthrow its government, and place its people under military occupation in the name of self-defense. And can you imagine if we can do that in the name of self-defense? Think of all the countries that are in far more objectively vulnerable situations relative to other countries, what rationales they could use. You'd have countries invading each other all over the place. And it's important to remember that both John Kerry and John Edwards were among those who voted in favor of that resolution. And frankly, it boggles the mind the Democratic Party would actually nominate as their presidential and vice presidential candidates 2 senators who are either stupid enough to believe that Iraq was an imminent threat to the national security of the United States or dishonest enough to claim that it was anyway. As a result, whether it is President Bush or President Kerry who governs over the next 4 years, there is a real risk that he'll try to convince Congress to authorize the invasion of additional countries under similarly false pretenses. Already both Bush and Kerry have been making exaggerated claims about the supposed military threats and ties to terrorists emanating from Iran and Syria. And both have threatened to use force against these countries in the name of preemption. And this is what really this Bush doctrine is all about. It has nothing to do with the right of self-defense. It is largely a rationalization for the right of conquest. And there are alternatives. There are alternatives, particularly from the threat of weapons of mass destruction. The same alternatives that have been put together for Latin America, for the South Pacific, for Sub-Saharan Africa, the establishment of a nuclear-free zone. Why can't we do this in the Middle East? Iran has called for establishment of a nuclear-free zone. Syria has. Iraq under Saddam Hussein did. So have American allies like Jordan and Egypt. But the United States rejects that because we want to still be able to bring our tactical nuclear weapons into the area. We want our allies like Pakistan and Israel to be able to have their nuclear weapons. We want to impose a kind of nuclear apartheid where we get to decide which countries can have weapons of mass destruction and which ones cannot. Even putting aside the moral and legal questions, that's simply not going to work, because whenever you try to impose by force a regime of haves and have-nots, it just motivates the have-nots to become the haves. This kind of policy is actually increasing the risk of proliferation. I have to respectfully disagree with the Osirak reactor bombing by Israel as a positive precedent. Osirak was not the major nuclear facility Iraq had at the time, and the bombing gave Iraq an incentive to actually increase the development of its nuclear weapons programs. Why? Because they knew Israel had a nuclear weapons program. They're afraid Iran might be doing it again. This would not have been the case if the United States took the lead along with the rest of the world in trying to establish a nuclear-free zone. Given the power the United States has in the world and its capacity to do both great good and great harm, even small differences in foreign policy can make a huge difference in the lives of millions of people. And that's why I personally hope, given that we only have 2 realistic choices, that Kerry wins the election. However, I do believe that we Americans and the rest of the world deserve better than a kinder, gentler imperialism. I really do believe we need to have a system that's based on multilateral approaches that emphasize the rule of law, not this kind of reckless unilateralism, because there is a lot at stake here. The effective endorsement by both the Republican and Democratic parties that the United States has the right to unilaterally invade sovereign nations seriously undermines the principle of collective security and the authority of the United Nations, and in doing so opens the door to international anarchy. Just as the relative peace made possible through the Concert of Europe and the League of Nations were both shattered by major militaristic powers which refused to play by the rules, so the United Nations system is threatened today by this bipartisan consensus and support of American unilateralism as embodied in the Bush Doctrine. The consequences of the demise of these 2 earlier systems for international stability were the 2 world wars. I hate to imagine what the consequences of current U.S. policy might be unless we are able to change course. And the only way I believe that we will change course is if the American people demand it. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert Rockhouse is a assistant professor of political science at UC Santa Barbara, and is, among other things, a graduate of Santa Barbara City College, not mentioned in his bio, but I thought I would mention it. Robert?
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the organizers for setting up this wonderful event. Prevention or preemption may not always be legal, but sometimes they are prudent. I'll stick to my 10 minutes, Peter, so I don't need that. I'm a good law-abiding citizen. My goal here today is not to win anybody over to my position or to change you in favor of preemption or against it. My goal is to, and now this is the problem because I have to use force because there's no law. And this is a classic example. Now the good news, of course, we could start calling the police and so forth, but that is the problem with international law. There's no policemen and states aren't always civil. But my goal today isn't to change anybody's view to make you in favor of preemption or against it, but it's to really talk a little bit about making sure that each of our own positions are consistent, that they're internally consistent, that they're logical, and that we apply them in a fair way, regardless of who the president is. I think that's especially important with an election cycle coming up, and it's a lot less difference between the candidates than I think a lot of people are really willing to recognize. Before I move on to preemption per se and talk about why I really think it's a non-issue, preemption as a doctrine, that in a lot of ways it's a non-issue. The issue is really about specific applications of a preemptive doctrine, in Iraq in particular, but not really preemption. Before I want to do that, I want to do a little sort of trick or a test about the issue of consistency that I'm driving at. And there's two little tests here. The first is a consistency test, and the second one will sound a little nastier. It's a hypocrisy test. But let's go through the consistency test first. Are you for or against preemption? You can go back and think through some recent examples. You could compare Bush's preemptive attack, or if you want to call it a preventive attack in Iraq in 2003, compare that to Bill Clinton's in 1998. You should really be in favor of both or against both. Compare 2003's invasion of Iraq with Bill Clinton's bombing of a sovereign nation, Yugoslavia, without any Security Council guarantees in 1999, without any genocide, and certainly not with any real threat of a breach of the peace, although that was the argument that was made. Are you on the same sides of both of those issues, or are you in favor of one and against the other? And you could push this further. It's an election cycle, so let me step away from preemption for just a few moments. There's a whole bunch of questions like this I like to ask my students. If you're a conservative, do you get really outraged by Michael Moore and his movie, but defend Ann Coulter? If you're a liberal, do you get really outraged by Ann Coulter, but think Michael Moore is the best thing since sliced bread? We can go through a lot of issues. Where are you on Castro and Pinochet? Do you think they're both dictators? Do you think they're both really terrible people that killed people to keep their regimes at gunpoint? Do you have the same feeling, or do you defend one and get mad at the other one? And there's other cases. Abu Ghraib was raised earlier. I like to compare Abu Ghraib to Waco, Texas. In Waco, 86 people died. 24 children and infants died. Did you demand Janet Reno's head? If you did, go for it. Demand Rumsfeld's head. If you defended Reno, I don't know if you can demand Rumsfeld's head. If you think Rumsfeld should have stayed in office, but you wish that Reno would have been removed as a result or fired, there's something going on here. This is probably making people a little bit uneasy because there's this thing called cognitive dissonance. And right now, everything kicking in is trying to weave through all the exceptions that explains why you can be in favor of one, but against the other. This is where the hypocrisy test comes in. And this is an important one. If you, for example, are a right-winger and you defend Castro and hate Pinochet, or if you're a left-winger and you defend Pinochet and hate Castro, I'll give it to you. You've established a logic pattern and a fact base to have a nuanced position. But surprisingly, it turns out that the way people defend or reject these positions has a lot to do with party affiliation and who is in office. And that's really important as citizens in an election cycle, that we generate an internal framework, a logical way of thinking about politics, and hold ourselves to that standard. I think reasonable people can disagree about preemption, but what blows my mind is the selective use of facts. In fact, entire amnesia about whole episodes. Let me go ahead and push into a few of those more deeply. Preemption. I'd like to argue it's really a non-issue. there's long-term domestic and legal precedent that says it's okay, that there's situations when it's okay. Should be a last resort, the threat should be imminent. There's some issues around it, but there's not a lot of disagreement on whether or not there's a place for preemption. The UN Charter might be one of the interesting places where there is. It's a very ambitious doctrine that said only self-defense. Now, international law precedes it and maybe supersedes it, so people say collective self-defense or preemption is a part of self-defense. But it's unclear whether anybody can really debate the longer international precedent of preemption. Set aside the legal basis for a second. What about politically? Politically, there's a broad consensus on this too. Both Kerry and Bush agree on the doctrine of preemption. How they might employ it, I think, would be different. But let me give you a couple quotes from Senator Kerry. The president always has the right and always has had the right for preemptive strikes. That was the doctrine throughout the Cold War. No president through all American history has ever ceded, nor would I cede the right to preempt in any way necessary to protect the United States of America. That was in a second presidential debate. It's completely consistent with what he has said throughout the campaign. Earlier, the comment was made that Bush has said, "I'll never ask for a permission slip." Kerry, in a major foreign policy speech here in California in March, said, "As president, I will not wait for a green light from abroad." Well, I could bring that up as my main talking point all the time, too, to show how out of line Senator Kerry is with international opinion. The consensus isn't just between the two parties. I would encourage all of you to read the 9/11 Commission report, because one of its main recommendations is that we need to embrace the doctrine of preemption. And so for anybody who's been clamoring for Bush to go ahead and implement the 9/11 report's findings, it argues for the doctrine of preemption. Another piece of consensus. The fourth one I thought would come up more today that really hasn't is the issue of humanitarian intervention. John did a great job of talking about the case of Rwanda. The French obstructed. I wish we would have ignored the world, thumbed our nose at them if necessary, and gone in and saved 1 million people from dying. I like international law a lot, and I'd like for us to be a better world citizen, but not at the expense of 1 million people. That's where the paper stops mattering to me. Broad consensus on preemption. What about particular cases? There's a lot of contention on Iraq. Reasonable people can disagree on Iraq. Different fact bases, different issues, different moral issues. Did we have legal authority? Let me go through a few of them. And actually, let me start by suggesting that all of you read Security Council Resolution 678 and 1441 for yourselves. Don't listen to any of us about our interpretations of it. Read it for yourself. Let me start there. My interpretation of it, 678 was very short. The UN never says you can use violence, you can use bombs. It says you can use all means necessary. 1441 declares Iraq in a material breach. It says it is not in compliance with 661, which originally authorized everything. 678, which authorized force. It said they were in a material breach. 1441 says they had nuclear weapons. They were continuing to support terrorism. And it even requotes the language on all means necessary. Read it for yourselves. Don't believe me. Go back and read it. So I don't buy the legal basis. In fact, I think there are so many powerful reasons to be against the invasion of Iraq that you can do it truly on the merits of the case without having to resort to that it's Bush is stupid or there's a neoconservative cabal or that it's necessarily immoral, illegal, or illegitimate. You could just make the argument purely on political terms. It has the potential to unite our enemies and divide us from our allies in its bad policy. But that's not the way you persuade people in an election year. You do it through emotional appeal. And that's how you win. Where do I stand on Iraq? This is my favorite quote from the president. In 4 years since inspectors left, intelligence reports show that Saddam Hussein has worked to rebuild his chemical and biological weapon stock, his missile delivery capacity, and his nuclear program. He's also given aid, comfort, and sanctuary to terrorists, including al-Qaeda members. It is clear, however, that left unchecked, Saddam Hussein will continue to increase his capacity to wage biological chemical warfare, and that he'll keep trying to develop nuclear weapons. Who in here believes that? The sad news, it was Senator Hillary Clinton on October 10th, 2002. I've got dozens of quotes from her right up to the start of the war. And I applaud, actually, both of these professors for you two are two of the only people I've met who are really truly consistent on these issues, because the debate out in the public is not this way. It's purely going after people that we don't like and supporting at all costs the people that we do like. Let me also say why I think it was important to end Saddam Hussein's very long term in office. Containment was a failed policy. We talk about it as though it was working. It wasn't. There was continually collapse of support for the containment policy. Another thing I would encourage all of you to read, don't believe anything I say, read Osama bin Laden's declaration of war against Jews and Crusaders. Read it for yourselves and see what that long rambling document is upset about. It's not our support of Israel. It's not about who we are, as President Bush would say. It's not about our colonialism. That document is all about our containment of Iraq, the starving of Iraqi children, the fact that we were having to patrol those no-fly zones from bases in Saudi Arabia. We had 2 aircraft carrier battle groups tied down. It was costing billions of dollars. Containment was not a costless policy. There were protests at every campus I've been affiliated with against what the sanctions were doing to children. Yet now today people are saying, well, the alternative is we should have kept the sanctions regime going. It's Orwellian. It's absolutely Orwellian to see this change. I think there's some good arguments to be made for why Saddam Hussein was removed. I think it's within the course of logical, reasonable discourse. I don't think we have to resort to a lot of name-calling to win the argument. I think sensible people can disagree on it. In conclusion, I would just encourage everyone to think through some of these positions, get a consistent framework, and hold your candidate accountable. For all the people in this room who may remain against preemption, neither Kerry nor Bush are your candidates. So I'd like to let you know that I'm endorsing Ralph Nader for you and encourage you to vote for him in this election.
Our initial speakers, Richard Falk and John Arguilla. Richard, would you like to speak first?
Well, I thank all 3 of the discussants for raising important and diverse issues. I think it's made our whole discussion extremely rich experience. I don't want to take time because I think more important with the time left over is to hear from all of you. When listening to Stan Roden's talking about empathizing with the enemy, which I think is absolutely crucial if we want to get beyond this stalemate that is now underpinning the approach to the terrorist challenge. I was reminded of Adlai Stevenson's remark more than 50 years ago that the item of technology that America most needs is a hearing aid. And it remains, I mean, it's truer than ever at this point. You may probably understand the issues then. So I think we can't really hope to respond to this extremely traumatic situation without not only empathizing with the enemy, but also separating the legitimate grievances from the illegitimate grievances. And we haven't tried to do that. One of the costs of saying they are evil and we are good is that there's no occasion for self-criticism or self-scrutiny. Everything we're doing is okay. What they're doing is the cause of the problem. And I think that's a very sterile way of proceeding. I think that Stephen Zunis brought our attention to an important matter of perspective that we now are fighting for the liberalism of our parents' generation, as he put it, rather than having something that would be moving beyond that. Instead of progress, we've had regress. in this period in many areas, particularly this use of force area. And it's up to us, and as he says, the American people, ultimately, to transform our perspectives on how we achieve security and promote the values that did make America a great country during much of its history, but have been betrayed, in my view, at recent times. And I agree very much with what Robert said about the degree of consensus that exists among the two candidates for president. And it's a distressing comment on the state of our political culture from my point of view. And we have to realize that if security was the only issue, if national security was the only issue, Bush would win in a landslide. It's only because of other issues that it is a dead heat. And that means, from my perspective, that we're living in a highly militarist and somewhat imperialist political society that wants to spread American power all over the world and wants to rely on war as the method of achieving security and doesn't want to heed the legitimate grievances of the rest of the world. So it's not only our candidates that we have to worry about, it's the state of our society and how we somehow achieve a pedagogy of peace that can bring our society into some kind of to a recognition that corresponds with the way in which many other societies, including European societies, feel about the way of achieving security. If one's looking for consensus, we're the ones that are out of step with the world at this point. And it's that disregard of the opinions of others that I find the most discouraging aspect of the present situation. I would have other things to say, but I'll refrain.
And John?
It's a privilege to be up here with all of you. These are wonderful points, and I too am just going to take a moment or so to share a few observations from each speaker, and then we can hopefully get into some good interaction with all of you. On Stanley Roden's points, which I thought were exceptionally well taken about the sort of legal status of preemption and preemption. I like the notion of police action. We have to be careful with such terms. Korea is still known to history as a police action, and that was a very major war. I think the point that he was making, which is so important, is that, okay, to the extent to which there is a military aspect of this war, it mustn't look like other wars. It shouldn't include strategic bombing. For example, why were we using, quote, shock and awe bombing against the Iraqi people whom we said we were going to liberate, that the war was all about liberating? So it takes a whole new habit of mind that we have to cultivate. And I'm a funny divided person. I'm an academic, and yet I live and work in the military. And so my academic colleagues think of me as a warmonger, and my military colleagues see me as a peacenik. And so my life's aim is to just try to keep the debates civil as much as I possibly can. So to Stanley Roden, I would simply say amen, and we have to figure out, to the extent to which there is a role for the military, it should be the sorts of things I spoke about earlier, the onesies and twosies, grabbing the little terror cells here and there now and then. Strategic bombing is itself, in my view, against the laws of war because of what it does to non-combatants. I applaud your position. To Stephen Zunis, that was so heartfelt, and you reached me with what you said, and I think we all need to listen to this. And this country is a republic, not an empire. As when we had Greek History 101 earlier, I lamented the fact that the Athenian democracy decided to become a great empire, and it corrupted itself and destroyed itself in the end. And I think there are cautionary things to be said about that, and that we just need to be very careful about. And it is so unseemly that a time when the world is divided, when the American people are deeply divided over our role in the world, that the choice the American voter has in a few weeks is limited to people who see the world almost entirely the same way. With regard to Robert's comments, I just think this point about consistency is so powerful. And I just want to reemphasize a point. Well, wait a minute. We say we want to spread democracies, but not to places where it would be inconvenient for us. This isn't a war about democracy. For me, in the business that I'm in, it's a fight for the future. And for me, the future is compromised if small distributed terror networks have the most destructive weapons. Not only small nuclear weapons, but in the next few years, biological weapons are going to be achieving levels of destructiveness that mirror those of smaller nuclear weapons. We must prevent that world from coming into being. A small part of preventing that is military. Some of it has to do with law enforcement. A lot has to do with intelligence. But a very, very great deal has to do with what Secretary Mueller talked about as the new great power, public opinion. The world has to be galvanized around arms control, around a public diplomacy that doesn't want to allow the creation of that particular world. To Professor Falk, I'll only say again, amen to hearing aids. And to me what that means is that everything we do in the world has some physical impact on it. It also has some impact in the informational domain, that is, in the opinions of others, with this great power of public opinion and of other nations. And so it is exceptionally important for us that our behavior be exemplary. That doesn't mean we stop using force where, after lots of careful reflection, it's deemed to be useful in some fashion. And I agree there are many cases where it gets problematic. Even the Israelis at Osirak only slowed down the Iraqis and made them redouble their efforts. But thank goodness they'd been slowed down enough for us. And they did prevention also of a very select sort. Saddam was trying to build long-range superguns. Maybe people will remember this, through a fellow named Gerald Bull. And the Israelis basically assassinated him and upended that network. And President Bush upended a terrorist nuclear weapons proliferation network, the AQ-Khan network operating out of Pakistan. I think it's important that we look and we try to find the good and the things we can agree upon whenever we can. And that, to me, is my own personal goal, is to try to see that these debates be undertaken in a civil way. It's unseemly that our presidential candidates can't find that. It's wonderful that this panel today has found that. And again, I think this is a kind of code of exemplary behavior that we need to show not only the rest of the world, but our own people. In these red and blue times, which seem to say that the United States is so divided, it seems to me it is especially incumbent upon us to reach out to understand why people hold the beliefs they do in heartfelt ways, and to try to find and to enlarge wherever possible those areas of agreement, particularly on national security policy. Thank you.
If there's no objection, I'll go to questions. Does anybody have something they'd dearly like to say before? Okay.
A couple things real quick. I think this one.
I think it is.
I think there's an important distinction, and I think most people who were involved in the anti-sanctions campaign did make the distinction between economic sanctions against Iraq and military sanctions against Iraq. There were serious humanitarian consequences regarding the economic sanctions, and ironically it strengthened Saddam Hussein because it decimated the middle class, which was the primary agent for change in Middle Eastern countries. It made people even more dependent on the government for ration cards and handouts, and people were so desperate it was even harder to take the already considerable risks to challenge him. But I don't know anybody who believed that there should be any lessening of the very strict sanctions on military equipment, on raw materials, on technologies that could in any way help Iraq reconstitute an offensive military capability. So I just wanted to make that important distinction.
Okay. Thank you. Chelsea, where are you? There you are. Why don't you exemplify how we do this? Step up to the microphone and pose your question. And the rest of you may be thinking about your question. Chelsea.
Okay, thank you. A major theme today has been nuclear proliferation. A world without nuclear weapons is a reasonable ideal, and in that situation, as it's been stated today, the United States would actually be at an advantage. However, with nuclear technology in the possession of so many nations today, could it ever be a safe decision for the U.S. to completely shut down its nuclear weapons programs? And would a nuclear weapon in the hands of terrorists not be an even graver threat then?
Do you want to address that to anybody in particular or to everybody in general?
Everybody in general.
All right. Anybody care to be first responding?
Well, I guess I sort of raised that point, so let me say a few words about it. I don't think we need any new nuclear programs, that's for sure, these bunker-busting bombs. I don't think we need to do much to maintain existing stockpiles that we have. We have thousands of these weapons. In total warheads, it's something like 20,000 right now. And I talked a few minutes ago about being exemplary. We could get rid of 60 to 70% of those very, very quickly. And I think that would be a real sign to the world, again, in this battle of the story I talk about. If the United States actually led by example, we could bring back, reduce this threat or the demand others might have to create arsenals of their own. We have verification means that are very, very good, and while total abolition it's certainly a goal that we've signed on to with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That treaty says that other people will refrain from developing these weapons, and those of us who have them will work to get rid of them. So that's a law we've agreed to, and I think we have to strive for. We do have to be very careful as the numbers get lower. As you say, in a world where we've all given up our nuclear weapons and the terrorists have a few, or some cheater has a few hundred, that's a very destabilizing problem. So but at a minimum, again, I want to try to find that consensus that we could all reach. At a minimum, we could do with far, far fewer nuclear weapons that are in the world today.
Let me start with what my heart says. My heart says, boy, I wish we could live in a world without nuclear weapons. Let me tell you what my head says. The United Nations had no effect on stopping the start of the Cold War. The United Nations had no effect, really, on the ebb and flow of the Cold War. And it had nothing to do with when the Soviet Union collapsed and went away. I believe what kept 60 years of peace between great powers was nuclear deterrence. It's the first time in the history of the modern state system that great powers hadn't fought for such a long, extended period of time in a direct war, in a great war. Think about the Cuban Missile Crisis. If Cuba would have been building a base there, we might have invaded Cuba, and they would have taken Berlin. It could have been World War III. Instead of that being close to a major war, I look at it as actually being quite far away. In my heart, I really wish we'd get rid of nuclear weapons, but my head and my checkbook tell me that if we did, I would quickly go out and start buying stock in Raytheon and Textron and other defense contractors, because there's going to be a lot of wars breaking out.
I think it's important to recognize that the United States is actually legally required to get rid of its nuclear weapons. A non-proliferation treaty, in return for non-nuclear powers agreeing to not develop nuclear weapons. The existing nuclear powers at that time, the Big Five, including the United States, were to take, I forget the exact wording, but it was basically, it was clear it was not going to be tomorrow, but they were going to take some significant steps and good faith effort to eliminate them, and we had not done that, which makes this double standard. It's not just saying that, our allies Israel and Pakistan can have nuclear weapons, but countries we don't like cannot, that's harming our efforts. It's the fact that we're saying that we get to hold on to these things despite our obligations to do so, whereas if Iran is even in technical violation of some NPT thing, that's grounds for sanctions or war. And that's, again, that kind of double standard is not going to work. One real problem with the NPT, unfortunately, is that, and this is largely pressure, frankly, from the nuclear power industry, was that it actually encouraged the development of civilian nuclear power. And that has, has been cover for almost every effort of procuring nuclear weapons by non-nuclear weapons powers since that was passed. And I think even putting aside the threat for as a way of making nuclear weapons, nuclear power is in itself an economic and environmental hazard that should not exist either. And so I think that, and I think it's important that if we're going to get to that point, we're going to not only make sure that that all nations take a good faith effort to disarm, but we go to safe, renewable alternative energies and eliminate nuclear power as well.
Okay. Stan?
The first question, it seems to me, you have to ask in order to continue on a path towards some sane control of the problem is what method are you going to use, and that comes to the road divides, and the first question is the United States going to be able to do this unilaterally? And I think the answer to that is clearly no. If the answer is that it's going to take some collective forces to make it happen, how is it possible that we're able to do that unless the United States plays a role in that effort? Can the United States play a role in that effort if it continues to speak on the one hand of the rule of law and violate it on the other? Can you provide leadership if you don't show integrity? Can you in any way enter into a process that may lead us to sanity on the question of nuclear proliferation if we don't set an example? And I think the answers to all of those things are no. So we're, in our effort to become maximally secure, we are making the rest of the world maximally insecure. And I hate to quote Henry Kissinger, but he said that about 40 or 45 years ago. So it seems to me the process we should be talking about is collective security, whether done through NATO or the other organizations or maybe new organizations, but clearly the United Nations is a cornerstone for continuing that effort.
Next question. Thank you. Please give us your name. And
I'm Jim Carls. I'm Vice President of our local United Nations Association and a lifelong supporter of the UN as the vehicle for achieving peace in the world. I have a question that any of you might address, and it's in relation to the potential for the UN really being the major vehicle for avoiding the unilateralism and the preemption that we're talking about here today. The issue is around the Security Council, and the question I have of you is your opinion as to the potential for the Security Council being so constructed that we do not have the comments like I need a permission slip or a green signal from the UN in order to proceed. And I appreciate I assume you know what the issue is, Security Council, the composition of it, and the objection by our country and maybe even a few other, particularly our country, to the position that decisions are made by third world countries that would be negative for us.
who would like to start? All right, Richard Falk.
Well, I think it's an important concern. I believe that it will be very difficult in the foreseeable future to find the composition of the Security Council congruent with the priorities of American foreign policy unless those priorities change. In other words, the pressure within the UN is actually to make it more representative organization, more representative organ than it now is, and include countries like India and Brazil, possibly Germany and Japan as permanent members. That will make it even more difficult to achieve a consensus that will be consistently to Washington's liking. But I think the real test here is whether we can live or try to live in a more cooperative world. Are we willing to take the risks of cooperation and fidelity to the rule of law, even understanding that that may go against our perceptions of national interests at certain points? It seems to me that's if we want the UN to work, we have to be willing to live with the possibility that it will decide against us on certain occasions. I don't think it will decide against us irresponsibly. I think that if you look at those issues where the UN has opposed what the United States has wanted to do, particularly the Security Council, in almost every case I would agree with the resistance to American priorities. And so I think we would be better off, I felt for a long time, we would be better off deferring both to international law and to the UN authority. We would have avoided the two worst disasters in recent American foreign policy, the Vietnam War and the Iraq War. So it is what the sociologist C. Wright Mills once called crackpot realism, to think that you are better off because you retain the discretion to violate international law and the UN. I think we would be better off in the 21st century if we could accept this commitment to a multilateral process that might not always please us in every particular instance.
If I may add, I think one very good side of Security Council reform would be to eliminate the veto and replace it with some kind of supermajority. So an individual country's parochial interest, such as France and Rwanda, would not get in the way, but at the same time, if in the case of the U.S. request for a second resolution to authorize the invasion, they couldn't even get a simple majority, even without the threat of vetoes from France and China and Russia. It was, it was pretty clear that we were going against the vast majority of the international community. And just let me say for the record that in the case of 1441, that the majority of people who supported that resolution were quite clear in statements they made during the debate and subsequently that it was not an authorization for a military force, that a second resolution was necessary. That's been reiterated by the Secretary General himself, and indeed, if 1441 was enough, why did the U.S. try so hard to get a second resolution? But that's another story. I'd also mention that I think that it wasn't just the French that prevented us from going to Rwanda. We were burned in Somalia, and I think there's a lot of pressure inside Washington, even without a threatened French veto. I think it would have been hard to do that as well. But I think the bigger question is I do think that some kind of a reform that eliminates the veto would do good. And I think it's also important to point out that in the past 35 years, the United States has used its veto power in the Security Council, and as the only dissenting vote in the entire Security Council, I think 3 times more than all the vetoes by all the other permanent members during that same period combined. So it's the United States really that has been abusing its veto for its parochial interest more than any other nation.
John Arguello?
Well, I want to associate myself with both those sets of comments. I think Security Council reform is a very, very powerful idea. And again, it goes to that hearing aid issue. You've got to be able to tell and to sell your story to the United Nations in order to pursue a policy. That's a healthy thing. And as Professor Falk suggests, a good way to avoid big mistakes. For me, the UN is exceptionally important in this 21st century world because all the problems that really matter can't be solved by individual nations. We're finding that now. We're 3 years plus in this war on terror, and we realize how hard it is to grapple with our enemy, or enemies plural. And we don't have a chance of defeating terrorism without a true global coalition. And prior to Iraq, we had that. About 100 nations were signed up. We had and still have troops from about 20 countries cycling into and out of Afghanistan, where even small numbers make a very big difference there. So it's obviously something that we have to work together with others to try to solve, especially fighting networks that may be in 60 countries. But look beyond that to the whole issue of air, of clean water. A third of the population of the world doesn't have clean water. The fishing stocks in the oceans, the whole issue of transnational crime. These are things in a globalized world that exist far beyond the ability of sole and individual countries to deal with. And so it seems to me very obvious that it is not only in the world interest, but clearly in the American interest to foster a strong and reinvigorated and increasingly empowered United Nations.
Any other comments from our panel, or a new question from our...
Actually, I want to do a quick
Robert?
follow-up on John's comments. I think the United Nations is a wonderful organization when it comes to fighting disease, poverty, providing clean drinking water, dealing with a lot of important humanitarian issues around social justice. And it's really where the UN spends about 80% of its time. The problem is all the public debates and the way that the UN is really taught in colleges and the way the public thinks about it is that it's about peace and security. And I really wish we could refocus the UN on the things that it does very well and just realize that the Security Council is tough to reform. You can maybe expand it, which makes it more unruly, but you're not going to get France or Britain or declining powers off of it. There's always going to be a veto. There's no way that's going to be reformed to a supermajority or other type of voting. And I think sometimes the UN is just somewhat disruptive in security affairs, and I really wish that Kofi Annan would put his diplomacy and his good heart to use with fighting hunger and poverty and disease, and that we would focus the public's attention a lot more on those areas where there's support. And maybe over time that would spill over. But I think the effort to get them so involved in security is just really backfiring, and they're a step short of really becoming the League of Nations in terms of where they are on peace and security.
Okay. Richard?
Just a small comment on what Robert just said. I agree that there are many shortcomings associated with the UN approach to peace and security, but one shouldn't jump to from that to the assumption that states are doing such a great job with peace and security themselves. And I, at this point, would rather trust the peace and security of the world to the UN than I would to those who are administering our own government.
One of the things that was touched upon during some of the various speeches was the cultural issues surrounding the Middle East and also Islam. How would we be able to somehow address and ultimately heal the growing cultural schism regarding Islam and without inflaming it further or leading to colossal somehow suppression of religion and rights?
Who would like to tackle that one? Okay, Stephen, I think you
theme of a recent book of mine. It's called Tinderbox, U.S. Middle East Policy and the Roots of Terrorism. I argue that we are not hated by these extremist Islamist movements because of our values, but because we've strayed from these values. It is not because of our freedom and democracy, about which we are justifiably proud, but the fact that our foreign policy in the Middle East has had nothing to do with freedom and democracy. It's been about supporting these repressive dictatorships and occupation armies. Our number one, our military aid to the Middle East is 6 times our economic aid. The number one commercial export for the United States, that's not counted in the foreign aid figures, is not consumer goods or high-tech products or agricultural surpluses. It's armaments. The people in the Middle East don't see our freedom and democracy. They see Made in USA on tear gas canisters and bomb casings. They don't see the ordinary hardworking Americans that gave us the world's strongest economy. They see the most crass and vulgar examples of American-style consumerism and materialism enjoyed by a handful of their elites while the vast majority of their people suffer in poverty. It is not out of, if you look at the rise of extremist Islamist movements, as I have studied, they come out of areas where there's been lack of democracy. Countries that are more pluralistic Islamic parties tend, they wouldn't be ones I'd vote for necessarily, but they work within the Bali politic as regular political parties and do not resort to violence. It's only when they're suppressed you see violence. And the other variable is great social dislocation, and that can be from war, like Afghanistan, Lebanon, Palestine, etc., or from economic policies, including this free market fundamentalism that the United States is pushing through various international financial institutions that has grossly exacerbated the social inequality, where you get these reactionary mullahs that will take advantage of people's legitimate grievances and twist them to their illegitimate concerns. So I want to underscore what previous speakers said today about the importance of looking at the underlying factors. And that doesn't mean that there aren't situations where we do need to take targeted paramilitary action against terrorist cells and that kind of thing. But if we're going to address the problem at all, it's going to come. We need to look at the underlying causes, because it's not about Islam per se. It's about basic human rights and social justice.
Richard Falk, next.
Yeah, just a small addition to what I think Stephen expressed very well, and that is, I think it's extremely important that we understand the diversity and pluralism within the Islamic world. Islam is not one thing, and it certainly is not to be identified with the extremism of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And the fact that you have this extremism is connected with a series of structural factors of the sort that I think were just described. So we need to understand Islam as one of the world's great religions. We need to understand that we have important Islamic minorities living throughout the West, throughout our own country. And we need to understand that our own Judeo-Christian civilization also has the potential to give rise to extremism and has acted on the basis of very extremist ideological postures from time to time throughout its history, and including against Islam itself. The Crusades were one expression of this militant, aggressive Christianity. So we have to, again, understand the other by a deeper understanding of the self. And I think in that way we can move toward a world where diplomacy begins to replace violence as the way of addressing conflict.
Thank you.
Of all the various justifications that there are for a preemptive war, it seems that the implicit question is, what is it that you would be accomplishing? There are obviously policy questions having to do directly with defense, but there are also cultural issues that have to do with who might deserve defense. Deserve obviously in quotation marks. So the question is how these justifications met themselves out. I was framing that as a difference between cultural ideas that say, things like that the rights of sovereignty mean something different throughout the world, depending upon the cultures out of which they come. So there seems to me an inherent conflict between holding to principles of human rights that claim to be universal versus cultural ideas that differ on international law in general.
Now I think I know what you're getting at. So let me throw this out. There's two different themes to U.S. foreign policy. There's been a long-standing sort of Jeffersonian early on, later on Wilsonian theme that is building the shiny city on the hill at home and promoting democracy and human rights abroad is a worthwhile goal. What's missing in that approach is that there's not often a well-articulated policy of how we should use force abroad. Then there's another school that's kind of Hamiltonian, or now I guess we'd say Kissingerian, that looks at national interest fairly narrowly defined and believes that you use power abroad. but you tend not to really have a reason to use it other than narrowly defined national interests. So there's no sort of place for the deeper American ideals. It's incredibly rare and unusual that you see those things fused together into one platform, and that's what the Bush administration has done. Unfortunately, they didn't articulate what they were doing early on, and instead of doing something that really could have driven a consensus between two dominant approaches, they've now left themselves in a situation where if they start to bring up what was initially the rationale, it's going to look like they're just going to say and default to anything that they need to in order to justify this war. But this is the first time where you've really seen an administration so carefully craft those two things together. In World War II, it looks like we did that. We did a couple of regime changes, more than two in fact, Germany and Japan being the big ones. And there was a fusion over time of realpolitik with Wilsonian idealism, but it turns out a rebuilding of Japan and Germany weren't just due to these beliefs. There were real questions about what to do, but once the Soviet threat came, then there was a deeper belief that, well, we need to keep them going, we need to resuscitate their economies and so forth. So it was an evolving policy over time. But this is the first time from inception that those two things have been fused together, and if I would have guessed, I would have imagined there'd be a tremendous consensus. And instead what they've done, this happens when you drive in the middle of the road on some things, you get hit by both sides, they've actually alienated both realists and Wilsonians. And that's the situation I think we're in.
Okay.
I would
John
talk
and
about,
then Richard. Go ahead.
I would talk about emerging in a slightly different way, and that I believe that I think that what 9/11 in Iraq has illustrated is that there's really no contradiction between a foreign policy that is based on ideals such as human rights and rule of law and a secure America. Because it's, we've done terrible things in the third world in the past, but the Vietnamese and Nicaraguans never flew airplanes into buildings. The stakes are a lot higher now. And our policy of supporting dictatorial regimes, and our policy of supporting occupation armies, and our efforts to support procurement of weapons of mass destruction by our allies while using similar efforts at procurement as an excuse for invasion and occupation for countries we don't like. It's these kinds of things that are helping to create the animosity that is so threatening. And I think that what we really need, if we did have a consistent ethical foreign policy, would not just be more consistent with our values, we would also be a lot safer. Part of the problem is I think we do have this tradition of American exceptionalism. This city on the hill mentality has taken on this kind of thing where it becomes very difficult to look critically at ourselves. And the fact that we attracted many immigrants who just wanted to be left alone, to push westward, whatever. We don't like anybody telling us what to do. We're not comfortable being part of any alliance we can't effectively control. And I remember seeing as far back as the 1970s the cover story of the New York Times Magazine, the UN's malaise, it was called. And it was about all these votes, so it was 140-something to 1. The United States, I don't know what's wrong with the UN. And it reminded me of the old joke about the proud mother watching the parade go by and say, everyone's out of step except my Johnny. And I think perhaps the biggest cultural transformation we need to consider is to be more humble, to look more self-critically, not in a reactive way like a lot of people on the left do. I think it is wrong to say we're the fault of all the problems in the world, and it is the other side saying we're the solution to all the problems in the world. But we do need to, step back enough, which is a lot easier now in this time of the internet and global communications, and we can get newspapers from all over the world on our internet every morning, to try to think a little bit about how the rest of the world sees us and take a more truly humble position.
Thank you. John and then Richard.
Yeah, on this cultural point, I think we're exploring a third way. Classic conservatives love to have a lot of military capability, but don't care much about human rights. Classic liberals care a great deal about human rights, but tend to be anti-military. Now we're talking about an era in which we will have great military force and think a lot about human rights. That's perhaps the most optimistic cultural solution that will have crafted this third approach. And it's stay tuned. I think it depends a very great deal on this consistency and this ability to be self-critical. But we do have a chance to cultivate this third way.
Thank you. Richard.
Yeah, just a very small addition to the comments that have already been made. I think one needs to be very reluctant to engage in interventionary diplomacy for the promotion of universal principles. I agree with what we've earlier said, that in cases where genocide is occurring or there's really strong evidence that it's about to occur, that is an exceptional circumstance that would justify intervention. But the notion of imposing democracy by military force is I think, very self-defeating and likely leads to a failure to achieve democracy, and also to a lot of hypocrisy. It raises this issue that Robert raised for us earlier about the hypocrisy test, and I think some of John's comments went to it also. Do we really want democracy in the Middle East, where the first result of a democratic process would be to produce intensely anti-American, anti-Israeli governments that would be much more problematic for us? The only way the present strategic interests of the United States can be safeguarded in the region is by the stability of authoritarian governments. And that's what we're going to end up with if we're lucky in Iraq.
Stan?
You know, crossing the cultural divide, I'd like to go back to something Richard touched on here a few minutes ago. You know, it starts with us, or it starts with you. And the echo chamber that we have in this country is so parochial through the news organizations that the education process to cross the cultural divide begins at home. It begins with each of us. It begins in the schools. It begins in our parenting. And it begins with a way of reaching out to try and find information beyond that which is being fed through Fox and CNN and the like. And I just think that there's this tremendous amount of belief in ourselves without any understanding of who it is that else is out there who may think differently than we do. And then again, that's listening to the echo chamber instead of listening to each other. And we see this played out every day.
Thank you. We come to the end of our program, and I'd like to give the panel members an opportunity to reflect on what they have learned. And I'd ask you to be extremely brief about, well, no, maybe not. Maybe you've learned a lot. I think I certainly have. What have you learned? What lessons should we be taking away with us from today's discussion? Anybody like to start?
Well, I'll just be very brief. I mean, there's more agreement than disagreement. Mm-hmm. There's more understanding that pure or the current American form of unilateralism hasn't worked, has gotten us into some serious trouble with long-term consequences, and we need to find our way back to the path of setting a better example and living, not only talking about the rule of law, but living under the rule of law both at home and abroad.
Okay. Stephen, briefly.
I think this underscores that the idea of a strong United Nations and adherence to international legal norms is not, some woolly, idealistic, liberal notion, but it's something that is very practical and very pragmatic. Indeed, it is far more realistic than those who believe that justice and democracy and peace can come through high-altitude bombings, through invasions, and through believing that somehow we can exempt ourselves from the kinds of norms that we expect other countries to follow.
I would add two comments. The first is, I think this discussion that we've had today does validate the importance of dialogue on these very tender and sensitive issues. And I think the organizers of the event today should be congratulated for producing this kind of discussion. And it is, to me, having participated in many kinds of events of this sort, it's one of the most successful efforts at bringing diverse points of view to bear and yet keeping a civil, constructive conversation going. And so I think the audience also should be congratulated for their contributions to that result. The other comment I wanted to make was that I think all of us agree that the mainstream of American formal political process does not seem likely to have the answers to the kinds of questions that have been discussed by the panel. In other words, many of us feel, as I do, that it's important that the election goes one way rather than the other. But however it goes, it will require a much more drastic change in American political culture if we are to begin to have constructive responses to even something as concrete as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You know, it's remarkable the degree to which we all seem to agree that American military assistance, for instance, to Israel is a misguided policy at this stage of both Israel's existence and the nature of the conflict. Yet to get from that agreement to the policy, it seems to me to be an almost utopian undertaking, because both political parties are essentially captive of the status quo with respect to this one-sided approach to the two parties. So it's up to civil society to create a new way of addressing the challenges that confront America at this stage, and it has to be a fairly radical way. And therefore, I think we need to have our young people understand the importance of nonviolence as an alternative to war, the importance of the rule of law as an alternative to unilateralism, and the importance of the United Nations as a source of governance for a planet that otherwise will be mired in chaos. So if we can both educate and activate, I feel we can have hope for the future. But if not, not. Thank you.
John?
I too have been very pleased by the amount of common ground we've all found, given our diverse backgrounds and perspectives, and I see in this a very hopeful sign. In Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he said the first true sign of Roman decline was the loss of civility of one Roman citizen for another. Today we've lit a candle for the return of civility in our own discourse in this country. Thank you.
Wonderfully planned and executed event, so thanks to all the organizers for setting it up. I would encourage everybody in the audience to just develop a morally and politically consistent framework, not just for preemption, but when, if ever, does it make sense to use force? The answer might be never. It might be sometimes. Hopefully it's not often. But the question is, some things may not be solved by the sword, but there may be instances where there are things that can't be solved without one. And there might be a place for war. War won us our independence. War stopped the South from seceding and ultimately put slavery on its course to its extinction. War stopped genocide in Germany. There's instances of where I think wars were clearly just and necessary. And if you accept that position, now you've opened a Pandora's box, because now you have to have some framework for saying when, if ever, it makes sense. And I just encourage you to think through that. Thanks.
I see somebody sneaking over to the microphone.
Since I was asked to open this wonderful meeting here, so enriching, I will also take the liberty of giving a little final note, namely a little piece of Beethoven with the text of Schiller, where the whole humanity becomes one family. So I'm going to play this on my little 10-hole harmonica.